Thank you for joining us once again, because I have a very, very powerful, wonderful, dear friend, guest to come on. Thank you for joining us as we continue our discussion about economics. And it's been a busy week, and my dear friend Ian Gribben is going to come on and give us an update, and we will continue our discussion on the economics situation, the economical situation that the UK finds itself in.
Perhaps we should tell the viewers that you and I, after our call last week that was videoed for them, we're on for another hour and a half, I think, to 2 hours, discussing all the things that you wanted to talk about. And a few of those we'll discuss today, but there's certainly a lot more stones to be unturned in the British economics and the financial sector. And we'll talk about a few of those today, Mark, if you like. But I know we've discussed a little bit about what our agenda will be today, which is, some of the data that has come out over the last week. Should highlight to viewers that the third week of every month is usually a very big data release for the previous months. It takes the various bodies, the statistical bodies, about 2 weeks after a month is over to put all of their data together. So we got a picture, one of the biggest pictures we have of the UK economy this week.
I mean, Ian, you're absolutely right. And we had a long conversation after our sit down, and to say to everyone, thank you for watching that. Please, thank you for joining us again, and please share it, because I'm very, very grateful and honoured to be able to sit down and Ian, because it's a life experience that we're bringing together. And I think the other thing is, both of us are interested in history, and we have to look back at history, and especially look back at the history over the last 40, 50 years of what's happened economically for our nation, if not before. So, Ian, you've just alluded to that a lot of data has been released over the last week. So where is the UK at today? Where is it at today in regard to all that data that's just been released? What is it pointing to?
Okay, so the first thing that came out this week was on the Tuesday, and that was our debt situation for December. And the various bodies of government that made estimates, the OBR, the Treasury, the Bank of England, the IFS, were all massively out with their number. We should have been in the range of about 14 billion of borrowing for December, and we were close to 18 billion. So the difference between the two figures is, certainly over 25%. And I can tell you that range of error in forecasting is insupportable. It's a terrible reflection on how badly these various bodies do their estimations. Now, they've made a few excuses. They said there were some one-offs in there, like buying military homes, which I think added about just over $1 billion to the overall bill. But it was a massively incorrect number, and that doesn't augur well going forward. And indeed, Rachel from accounts has been running around like a headless chicken this week, trying to figure out how to get economic growth going, even to the point where she's actually countenancing a third runway at Heathrow. So that tells you a little bit about how bad it is. Rachel Reeves is really in panic mode at the moment. So our borrowing is much higher than the authorities thought it would be. And now it's a matter of running around trying to either think about putting taxes up or getting spending down. The second piece of data that came out that most people won't have heard about is called the UK PMI. And all those acronyms, sound PMI sounds, quite a complicated kind of thing, but it really isn't. All it means is it's called the Purchasing Managers Index. And what happens every month, and there are various bodies who put it together. The most reliable is an American company called Standard & Poor's, and they release their data every month and have done for about 30 odd years. So it's the longest running time sequence we have. And what it is, it's not a complicated thing when it comes down to it. What they do is they have a group of employers in each country, and they send out a survey every month. And the person either on the board or there's a person in the accounting department who will go through and check a number of boxes and write a few comments. And what they do is they bring all of that together to get a picture of what's going on. And the interesting thing about the PMI and why it's so closely watched by the markets is because it gives a view, a forward view of where the economy is. So the type of questions they ask will be, what does your order backlog look like? How many new orders have you received? What is your employment situation? Are you looking to hire, or are you looking to cut costs? So from this bank of data, they can build up a picture, not just of where we are now, but of where the economy is likely to be. And so we had that on Wednesday, and the picture wasn't particularly good. The way it's constructed is that 50 on their little index means that everything is basically neutral, not going up or down. And they break this survey out into two sections. One is for manufacturing, and the other one is for the service side of the economy. And the service side of the economy is just narrowly on the positive side. So it's at 50.9. So that side of things is basically in a sort of a stagnation, if you like. And that is backed up by the retail sales data that we also saw for December, which was pretty bad. I think it was the worst Christmas in 13 years.
Wow.
In terms of the retailers. So watch out for some of the retail numbers, even people like Primark, which is, who you probably know, quite cheap clothing, and you'd expect them to be fairly steady. They said they had a terrible month, which is, they blame the weather, by the way. They said it was too warm, but no doubt it was, other factors, people having to tighten their belts, which has caused that. And then if we move to the more leading side of things, which is the manufacturing side of things, that shows us in effectively the worst reading since October of last year. That's at 49.3. So that shows that the manufacturing sector in the UK is in contraction. And alongside of that, there were some very interesting comments. One was the fact that input costs are going up. So all of the raw materials that they import from overseas have increased in price, probably most notably energy in that. A number of the comments that came back from these people said that they were very concerned about energy costs. The second factor was the national insurance issue, which we talked about last time, and that their view on hiring was negative. So we do look like the employment market is going to come into some trouble in coming months. That's what that is telling us. The other thing that sometimes affects the number is when a company's inventories are depleted, which usually happens when they're worried. So they won't order new stuff, and they'll slow down production because they don't want to build up a big inventory. And so they've been running down inventories from about June and July of last year. And now they're saying, we don't really want to, but even though inventories are low, we don't want to build up more inventory because we're worried about the state of the economy. So all of these factors really point to a slowdown that's going on. No real signs of recovery there, and really paint quite a bleak picture overall if you look forward 3 or 4 months, which is when most of this will be confirmed by data like the industrial production data. So not a great picture there. Let's leave the PMI there. And then we had our consumer confidence survey that came out. Now, this doesn't really have a long time series in the UK. In America, they've got a 30-year time series. Ours is only a few years old, but that was bleak as well. That was the lowest since it began a couple of years ago. That came in at -34. Again, it's a survey that's done amongst households about how they feel and what they'll be spending on. So things like what we call white goods, that's fridges, freezers, TVs, big kind of one-off purchases. That was particularly weak, as you can imagine. Again, people worried, tightening their belts. Mortgage rates have gone up, so people concerned about that kind of spending. Clothing, again, weak too. So that just left food, and tallying that up with the PMI survey, food inflation is reaccelerating as well, which bears out with the fact that the manufacturing side of things said their costs are going up. So food inflation is likely to reaccelerate from here as well, which is not what the government wants to hear. So I think that completes a somewhat dour week of data for the UK. And as I said earlier, Miss Reeves is running around trying desperately to find ways to boost growth to get over all of this.
Before we go on to discuss housing, which is another good indicator that you want to move into, the rushing around, panicking, it's not a good look, Ian, is it? Because, as you have quite rightly said, as we've discussed people have discussed for many years, confidence is what this is about. So how are the markets reacting in regard to confidence, especially as we've just had a huge political move in the fact that we've just seen the inauguration of President Trump in America? Is any confidence coming back because of that action? How will that influence us?
The American side of things, as I said last week, is going really well, and to a degree that will tow us along via our exports to the US. So that's very supportive. The other wild card in that is President Trump's intention to get oil production going again. I mean, he's been saying the past couple of days that he wants Saudi and OPEC to pump a lot more oil than they are doing, to take up production 10 or 15% for two reasons. One, with a lower oil price, the evil Mr. Putin in Russia will receive less revenue from his oil receipts, which means that he can't prosecute his war for too much longer. But that does have an impact on the UK as well. I don't know whether you've noticed. I noticed petrol is up from, it was about 122 about 2 months ago. It's at 133 now. That will again put a bit of a brake on the economy as well, and clearly that's been reflected in the PMI survey that I just mentioned. So costs are rising. We should add on this point that sterling is still trailing at one year lows now. We're down to sort of 121 at the moment, which is about, from the beginning of December, that's about a 10-15% sell-off. So that means that our the goods and the input materials and the energy that we import from overseas is all going up in price, and no doubt that again will feed into inflation in coming months. So again, that's going to force people to tighten their belts, Mark.
So wasn't there someone pointed out to me that there seemed to be a parity between the dollar, the pound, and the euro, and the fact that they seem to be nearly on the same line, approaching a 1-for-1. Is that a fair comment?
Yeah, I think so, because these things are all relative, but the dollar is at the center of the world. It's the currency that's used as the ultimate medium of exchange. If you're doing business even between, let's say, China and Russia, all of that is done in dollars. It's not done in yuan or ruble. So America, holds the strings of power by being the dollar. But if we look at sterling and we look at the euro, which have both been weak recently, sterling for the reasons that we've just given, but in Europe, they're having a really tough time as well. The economies there are stagnating, particularly Germany. And again, a lot of their problems boil down to the fact that energy is very expensive, not nearly as expensive as this country, but it is still a drag. And so if we look at a global map, and I know you wanted to come into China, talk about China at the end of it. If we look at a global map, it's only America that's really flashing green at the moment. Many of these other places, Britain and Europe, are at stall speed right now.
Absolutely. And as we've got the Donald going drill, baby drill, we need to look at the fact that we need to be, we've got all these oil reserve, etc. And we need to be getting those out. And that, to be honest, we could do a program, maybe we should do, on energy. So quickly, just moving on, what are your views on the housing market and house building, and what is going there, and what are your concerns there?
Well, I'd echo some of the more strident observers out there, particularly Liam Halligan, who runs the Daily Telegraph's economics podcast. He's one of the few who's really prepared to say what needs to be said. And this has been the state of play for well over 40 years now. But we have 4 major home builders: Taylor Wimpey, Barratt's, Persimmon, and Redrow, as the 4 big players in our market here. What really grabbed my attention is something Liam highlighted in The Spectator about 3 years ago, which was these group of companies are acting like an effective cartel over the market. To explain what a cartel is to viewers, that's when several companies, or indeed a single company, which we call a monopoly, hold complete sway over the market, and they act in less than let's call it less than open ways to control pricing of that particular market. The figure that I really want to bring to people's attention is the fact that a new home build will cost you 40% more than an existing home build. And the traditional way that these companies have said that why it's so expensive, the land acquisition costs are absolutely enormous. And that is not entirely true, because we've been through patches in our history where land acquisition costs have been similarly high. So they are making enormous profits out of the lack of supply of homes. They're charging, probably 20% more for a new built home than they actually should cost.
Right.
They also have down this food chain from the big 4. They also are able to control the supply of materials to them. They have such immense power, for timber, plastics, laminates, glass, that they can squeeze their suppliers down the food chain. So we've got this cozy little cartel that's been going on for a very long period of time. And to give you some historical context, which I know you like, the last time a newly built home cost 40% more than an existing home was in 1892, at the end of the Victorian period. So we really are in a centuries old situation. So that industry really needs to have the Competition and Markets Authority, what we used to call the old Monopolies Commission, go through it like a dose of salts. I've been keeping up on various university reports. There's a great one from the University of Southampton that pointed out that house building in the UK was almost as corrupt as some African states. So it's an industry that is in desperate need of regulation, if not, at the very least, some kind of royal commission to figure out what's going on, because getting people into cheaper homes and getting rents cheaper is a really great way of getting the economy going. And so structurally, that industry is really taking a lot out of people's pockets in a nutshell. The other thing I wanted to pass on to a little bit, which is related to this, is the fact that there's also something going on demographically as well. Right. As many of the viewers will know, we have a very elderly population and continued aging. And what this has meant, I mean, life expectancy over the last 30 or 40 years has gone up for men by about 7 or 8 years and women by about 10.
Yep.
And what this means is that we've got a lot of pensioners and retirees out there who are, I don't want to put this badly, but are not dying as soon as they used to do. And that means they're staying in their homes longer, which has also contributed to the fact that there aren't as many existing homes that are on the market as there would. So what we call the churn of the market and the amount of inventory that's there is worse than it was 30 years ago, simply because the increase in life expectancy has caused people to stay in their homes for longer. The other factor about that is that if I turn back the clock to the early 90s, of our residential housing market, around 2/3 of homes back then had a mortgage standing on them. But obviously, as people have aged and retired, their mortgages have been paid off. So only about 1/3 of the properties that are available actually have a mortgage sitting on them as well. So that means that there is a slightly lower sensitivity to interest rates. And that's important because really we shouldn't have any fears about a really horrible market collapse in housing, and that the Bank of England does have a freer hand to alter mortgage rates, certainly for younger people, which is something that I would like to see our party discuss, if we get close to the reins of power. But I just wanted to highlight that. We've also, just to end this topic as well, is one of the chief problems of why house prices have shot up since the credit crisis, is because we've allowed a lot of foreign buyers, particularly in London, to come into the market. And people like to say, certain economists like to say that, well, it's just London, don't worry about it, it's only this crazy London deficit. But what has happened in the last 20 odd years or so is that pushing up of London property prices has created what some economists call the donut effect. And what that means is that those London prices that have gone up. So it's probably best illustrated through an example. Let's say I'm a reasonably well-off chap and I'm living in one of the leafier parts of London, Belsize Park, or one of the nicer, sort of more inner places, is perhaps parts of Islington. I've watched my property in the first part of this century, double or triple. That has been enough to allow me to get another mortgage, a buy-to-let mortgage. But what I've done is I might have bought somewhere on the outskirts of London initially, and that has forced this effect outward. So I'm using the value of my property in inner London that's been pushed up by all this Russian, Chinese, Arabian money that's gone in. And I'm using the equity of my home in Islington to buy somewhere else. And slowly this pushes out across the country. I used to own a property in Brighton, and for years it didn't do. It was a nice place, and it didn't go anywhere in price. And then suddenly, about 10 years ago, my agent calls me and said, "There's something going on here. There's people, buy-to-let people, who are now seizing on Brighton as a good place to live with the connections to London." And so, what London has done is forced this mushrooming outwards as people seek to buy properties, let them out to people in the area. But what that has done is pushed rents up at the same time. So I just wanted to mention that, because I think people don't really put as much emphasis on the fact that London doesn't just have an impact on London, it has an impact on all of us riding out throughout the country. And now we've created this psychological situation where people think that property can never go down, and so they're buying places. And this has all sorts of run-on effects, of course, because the rents go up even in places where I'm calling from now, in St Leonard's. We've seen property prices here go up some of the fastest in the country in the last 10 years, even faster than London. And that's because all these landlord types who are buying up property are pushing up the prices, and that obviously has a knock-on effect to the councils, who have to provide social housing, and their yardstick is the private sector rent. So it puts taxes and council taxes up for the rest of us.
Absolutely, and last week when we spoke, or it might have been, I can't remember if it was after our podcast, but you said something fascinating to me, which was everyone's looking at London, the inflation prices within London, right. 11% or whatever, but actually in other parts of the country, inflation was at 3.5%. And what happens is that economically, everyone just looks at London and puts all their policies by addressing London instead of taking other things, which are, I think, more importantly, what's happening in the rest of the country outside London. I thought that was
I mean, it's almost
fascinating.
Almost like you actually need a different monetary policy for Newcastle and Tyne or Merseyside, and a different one for London and the southeast. You know, what's good for London, putting interest rates up to it's a futile effort if you want. As I said last week, it's a futile effort if the Bank of England thinks it can control consumer prices. It simply can't. But let's presume they still believe that, which they clearly do. Putting interest rates up to 5.5% is not what you want in Merseyside, Gateshead, and all these other places. You really need an interest rate closer to 2. And so, what they're doing by having this London-centric view is confining parts of the country to economic stagnation. And we all hear about the north-south divide in particular, but the way that we handle monetary policy is on a very London-centric basis. So they contribute to the north-south divide, if you like.
No, absolutely. I think and being flexible there, that is fascinating to me, because no one's thinking about this as far as I'm concerned. I can't.
No, well, I did say I'm not particularly orthodox, and a lot of
join the club.
Wisdom.
Join the club.
There's a lot of received wisdom out there that in the field of economics that really needs updating. What we teach kids in the schools and the universities. Maybe we'll come on to a couple of these things a little bit later, but really needs to be clarified and updated from the ideas that have endured for maybe a century or more.
No, and I fully agree with you. And I just at this point want to give a shout out to Liam Halligan, who I do think is excellent, and for people to look up what he's saying, especially when you say about history, we have to go back, and which is really, really important. You've just made a mention of housing. And using the term cartel, we can use another word, a monopolistic, right? So what other parts of our economy, in your view, suffer from this mindset of cartellism, that's a new word, and being a monopoly, do you think? What other parts?
Let me, you like history. So let me give you a little bit of a history lesson. I'm sure you're going to know most of this, and I'm sure most of the viewers do. But if we turn back the clock to, let's say, more than a century ago, to the late 1800s and the early part of the 20th century, we had the situation in the United States and elsewhere as well called the robber barons. And these were men who dominated the various industries and created almost monopolistic situations in many sectors. So steel, Andrew Carnegie, the Scot, who eventually owned about 55% of steel production, Rockefeller, who dominated in oil, the Vanderbilts, who basically dominated on the railways and New York subway system. And it got to the point where I think I may stand corrected here. Some viewers might know this or not, but it was the Teddy Roosevelt administration that recognized that these people were robbing the country blind and setting prices to very high levels, which allowed the rest of the economy to stagnate. If you're paying 50 times or 30 times more than you are for your rail ticket than you should be doing, then again it would slow things down. And so they came in with a set of laws that would stop this monopolistic behavior called the Sherman laws.
Yes.
And when any industry got big rather quickly and was making huge profits, the Sherman Commission would have a look at that and see whether it would be unfair, and then they would recommend a number of things, either special taxes, or they'd recommend breaking up the industry into pieces. This state persisted until the late 1970s. In the early part of the 70s, people may have heard of the main American telephone company that was, today it's known as AT&T, American Telegraph and Telecom, but 30 years before that it was simply called Bell. And Bell had their fingers in all sorts of pies, the research and development, and they monopolized the telephone market. And the Sherman Commission back in the early 70s recommended that Bell got broken up into various segments. So, at that time they were doing their own making of the actual equipment and manufacture. They were running the calls themselves. And so they ordered that the whole thing should be broken into 3 different pieces. And now that helped competition to thrive in the marketplace, and it brought down prices for consumers. And then we had a big change coming in the late 1970s, in 1978, when a Supreme Court judge called Robert Bork, who's just a lawyer who knows nothing about economics, wrote a book called the Antitrust Paradox. Antitrust, for viewers, is the American way of saying anti-monopoly. And what Bork wrote about was the fact that we shouldn't be breaking up all of these companies, that everything would be better if these companies were allowed to grow unhindered and not be broken up as monopolies. He made a number of reasons for that. The main one was that the sheer scale of a huge conglomerate company would be able to invest in research and development more effectively and with greater amounts of funds, and would also be able to achieve what we call economies of scale by having a smaller sales force selling more products. And the prevailing governments and orthodoxy back then was, the guy has a point, let's pursue this. So the Sherman Commission was eventually abandoned. They do have a fair trade commission over there now, but it's very, very neutered, let's say. So since that time, what we've seen, you asked for industries in the UK, but I think we can safely say that we can talk about more global industries. So ones where we've seen huge amounts of merger and acquisition is in pharmaceuticals.
Yes.
So the one people will know is GlaxoSmithKline in the UK, which is now, I think, the 4th or 5th biggest pharmaceutical company in the world. So we probably had about 30 or 40 years ago, we probably had 100 or 200 really big players, and now that's down to maybe less than 15. And the big selling point for pushing all these companies together was that they'd be more efficient, that drug prices would be brought down more quickly. But the key point was that research and development would be a lot bigger than it would be with all these smaller companies doing research and development. Well, I can tell you, having worked at the pit face of M&A for several years when I was in the hedge fund world, we all know that's simply not true. That what has happened is these companies actually are spending less as a group on research and development than they were when they were, if you added up all of their research and development, and when they were much smaller companies, it was much higher than it is today. And what has replaced that is higher returns for the shareholders.
Right.
So if we look at something like GlaxoSmithKline, the share price since their big merger 14, 15 years ago, it's gone nowhere, which means that there's no real growth in their in the company. What they do is they have a very big dividend. They throw out all of this cash to the shareholders, but it's not, certainly some of that cash that goes to the shareholders should be going into research and development. So, that's just one example of a sector that's merged. But I can give you that, for example, meat packing in the UK used to be controlled by, at least 50 to 100 companies. Now it's like down to 3 or 4.
Wow.
Again, that means that they control the marketplace, logistics, the same kind of thing. And so, you can call me, a big critic of capitalism, really, because I'm a true believer that having more competition in the marketplace is ultimately good for the consumer, and that all of these ideas that fell out of the late 70s have been detrimental to ordinary people. And we haven't even gone into the employment aspects of that as well, because these companies, if you had 100 companies with 100 different boards instead of 10 companies with a board, the boardroom pay levels were far, far lower than they were today. So you've got a concentration of boardroom pay, and I don't want to cover that today, but boardroom pay is, in my opinion, completely unaligned with boardroom performance in the UK. Any socialists watching will enjoy that last comment, and I'll expand on that another time. But there are lots of bad things, let's say, that have fallen out of all this merger and acquisition activity.
No, I no, Ian, brilliant. I mean, it just that again, as you said, is another program in itself. We could even in that even chat on. I don't want to go too deeply on this, but just want to make a reference to it, where suddenly there's figures being given of the amount of people that work in the charity sector, at the top of the charity sector, and some of the pay, the ridiculous pay that they are then paid, and the justification for that. Because I think this all leads into the same kind of ethos, frankly. And remember, of course, within the private sector, which is then funding the NGOs and all these charities. Ian, moving on, and I'm just going to, referring to this. So we are talking about the productivity of the economy, and you've made it, as we're discussing history, you're then going back to 1997 when the Tony Blair became prime minister in this country. You've made a reference when we've talked about this whole economic lag. The lag that's been created. Could you explain what you mean by that and the consequences of that?
Yeah. So productivity is a fairly straightforward number. It basically means the amount of output that we're getting per worker in society. And that hasn't gone very far in the UK. We lag the rest of the developed world quite substantially over the last 25 years or so. Why it's important is because the more output we can get per worker, the more taxes we take, and the easier it is to pay off our national debt. So if we look at the immediate post-war period from the early 50s through to the 1960s, we got a very big increase in productivity, and there were some key reasons for that. The first was that the workforce had shrunk after the war years. We'd lost 700,000 men. So we had this tightening of the workforce. Wages were going up. People were spending more. But more to the point is some of our industrial bases in Liverpool, Coventry, the heartlands had been, some of it wiped completely off the map thanks to Nazi bombing. And so building new factories and putting new machinery in place automatically increased productivity. That investment that the government and companies were making in more efficient ways to produce things. I mean, some of our industrial base up until that point in time, was decades old, and trying to compete against other countries was very difficult. So we had an enormous boost in productivity as that process went forward. But where we are today is substantively different. We have similar debt levels, but our productivity is terrible, and we're not going to get our debt levels down unless we increase productivity. And it's not just Tony Blair that I have some criticism of. I think Margaret Thatcher went a little too far as well in her movement to reduce the dependence on manufacturing in the economy. But really, a lot of the damage that happened to our industrial base happened under Blair in his first 10 years. And Blair had this idea that was fashionable amongst a lot of sociologists and economists at the time, that we were all moving to this wonderful post-industrial world where the service sector would, be our golden goose, if you like. And it hasn't proved to be that straightforward, to put it mildly. And many economists have been puzzling over why that might be the case. And I am a believer that some of the problem is one that's a fundamental misconception of what services actually do. So, I mean, if we take restaurants, financial services, insurance, all of these businesses, we like to think that putting computers into them, for example, and putting the internet into them is going to result in huge productivity gains. Well, one of the things that has happened is that putting computers into offices doesn't necessarily mean that we're all more productive, because you need IT engineers, highly trained IT engineers, and expensive IT engineers to maintain that, to maintain the systems. So it's I think we might have lost the signal, Mark.
Yeah, we have. What I've done, I've paused it. When it's back, we can immediately restart.
Okay, right. Grand, yeah.
That is really, listen, well done. That's just really, really annoying. I'm just going to check my end. How's your end?
I can't see you at the moment, but I can see myself.
No, but what I mean is,
shall I reload it?
Down? No, just stay there. Just stay there. Stay there. Is your internet down?
No. Hang on. Let me check. Hold on.
Oh, you're back. You're back. You're back. Brilliant. You're back. Ian?
Yeah, it's not particularly good down here, to be honest with you, but
you're back. Right.
Hi.
Stay there. Stay there. Well, this is brilliant, because we can continue, because I have managed to educate myself on how to do this. So, right, we will continue now.
Yeah.
So, Ian, you were just saying, in the joys of technical issues, then you're just saying about Blair moving in this whole thing of service economy, moving into then what Margaret did, where we're saying she went too far.
So, I probably went on a little bit too long, but the service economy is not giving us the productivity gains that people 20 years ago thought it would. There's a number of reasons for this. While we were off camera, then I was talking about, if you install a bunch of computer systems to, let's say, a insurance company, you think, well, that's great, they can make all of these cost savings. But what actually happens is if you look at the headcount, you save people who are typing in data and sorting the data in their computers, but you need people to, while you've got rid of staff in the frontline operations, you've increased your IT staff. So it's kind of a bit like a false economy. So there is a bit of productivity growth that comes out of that, but it's not as clear as it actually seems. And where the gains actually come is in the manufacturing and the designs of microprocessors and microchips, in other words, and the other technology, switching systems, servers, and so forth. And so the productivity gains that you think would be kept within the service sector are actually ending up in Taiwan, Korea, the United States and Japan, because we don't make semiconductors anymore. We closed our last major plant down in Scotland about 25 years ago now, and so we've got very little in the way of microprocessor manufacture in the country. But those are the guys who take the gains. You know, if you're using a cell phone, iPhone, smartphone thing, all of those gains again go to the manufacturers of all the components and the phone itself. So what we've been presented with is a false dawn. We're putting all these university students through university, and they're coming out with psychology degrees and journalist degrees, and none of this adds any value to the country at all. Not $1 gets added back. Maybe we can argue that our music and film industries are still strong and put them into the service sector, but the whole way that the economy is framed right now is in the wrong way. We need to get our high end manufacturing back again in the country, and even at the low end, we need to make our own steel. So that's the point I want to make on productivity, that we've gone down this dead end of thinking the service sector will provide us with all these gains, and we need to rethink it.
Absolutely. And in the sort of last 10 minutes, Ian, sorry to put you under pressure in one sense, no. I want to get to one of my favorite subjects, and an important subject that I think you are the person to go to for full explanation. So when I say the name Larry Fink, quite rightly, our backs go up, and we need to have a conversation about that. The man that was in 10 Downing Street, let's just say it, the pictures are there, with Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves just before the budget. Then when we say Vanguard, and then when we say State Street, Ian, could you give me, us, our incredible viewers, an explanation of their investment practice and how they manage their funds, and their view on, could we say they are true capitalists or not? Go in.
Okay, so we need to go right the way back to the early point of my own career as a junior fund manager in the early 90s. And back then, we were what most of the investments that our pension funds, life assurance companies, and other investment vehicles made was done on what we call an active basis. Now, by that I mean is that we had a group of fund managers for each particular region of the globe. And what we would do is we would pore over company accounts, balance sheets, income statements, cash flow statements. We would visit these companies. They would come and visit us. The boards would come and sit in our office, and we'd discuss their strategy and whether it was working or not. And we would be able to hold them to account if things weren't working, if they made a bad investment, if they'd sold off a business that they shouldn't have done. That's what's meant by active. We would engage with the company. And at that time, that was the way that most of the industry worked. And what started to creep into the 90s was the fact that the fees for doing that, obviously, if you've got to have a lot of people poring over the books of a company, what we call financial analysts, research analysts, there's a lot of cost involved in that. And so, a UK stock fund, for example, would back then perhaps attract costs of up to 2% per year, which would cover all the costs of having these highly educated people look at it. And then this idea came in. Legal & General were one of the people who are at the forefront of all of this, of what's called an index fund, which can be called a passive fund. So we've got the active side, who engage with companies and hold the managements to account and control their remuneration and all sorts of other things. And then we have this new development called the passive fund, which is literally what it says. It doesn't engage with the management. All it is trying to do is replicate an index. In the UK, that would most likely be the FTSE 100 of shares, which is literally just a aggregation of all their share prices formed into an index. And you don't need you don't need to visit the companies. You don't give a damn about what goes on inside the company. And that has seen massive growth over the last 30 years. And now that type of investing dominates. I think something like 60% to 2/3 of money that's invested in UK stocks is done on an index basis. Obviously, you don't need as many people to go and visit the company. All you're doing is just mathematically making sure that if the index itself changes in any way, which it does do from time to time, you're just there matching it. And that brings into all sorts of problems along with it. The first key one is that when a company, say I'm sitting as a CEO of a board, I'm very aware of the people who are on my register of shareholders.
Mm-hmm.
If I know there's, turn back the clock 30 years ago, 20 shareholders of pension funds that are all watching what I'm doing, then I know that I'm going to be scrutinized. But if I push the clock forward to today, when I know that half of my register is people who are not interested in how the company is run, then it gives me a license to, not a totally free license, but it gives me more power to do what I want to do without questioning from the shareholders. So this is what Vanguard, State Streets, and BlackRock actually get up to. They create these indexes, and of course the fees that they charge are very, very low. They might be like 0.1%, whereas an active fund will still be 1%. So if you look at that, it's 100. The fee itself each year is 100 times more expensive to have some research analyst, a fund manager, looking over that portfolio. So in my view, that's not real capitalism. Real capitalism is where people look at the potential of a company, of new technologies, and they invest in it because they see an opportunity, a potential opportunity. On the other side of things, of course, when industries are fading, the famous one was Eastman Kodak, the photography company. So they had the big shift to digital technology, and they went bankrupt, I think 20 years ago, when all of this stuff and cameras were coming out. So there's a function there for the active manager to sell their shares and buy digital camera makers like Canon and so forth. So what I'm saying is that active fund management lubricates the wheels of real capitalism, whereas these passive funds like Vanguard, which are super cheap, no doubt about it, but it's not really helping the motion and the oversight of capitalism that should be there. Just want to give a little example of this is that what happens when it's done in extremis is the fact that if you look at the credit crisis, where obviously all of the banks were in a dreadful situation, and so passive funds don't care about whether bank share prices have gone too high or not. It doesn't matter. They're just part of this index. And so bank share prices got pushed far too high, and when your share price is very high sitting in a boardroom, it feels like you've got breathing room.
Right.
You can go to, let's say you needed to build a new 100 data centers to process customers' information. That you can go to the stock market and sell a few more shares when the price is very high and it's easy to raise money. But when everything moves in an index, that gives the executives a false sense of what their value actually is. And so when the index increases, including many bank shares, there's this false sense of security, which was one reason why the credit crisis happened. Everybody thought it was okay. There are many active fund managers who said these share prices of banks trading on 3.5 times book value, 4 times book value. We haven't seen that since the 1920s.
Yes. Yeah.
And the index funds don't care about that. That's not in their purview to care. So there's lots of deformations that come along with it. But let's get back to our friend, the master of the universe, Larry Fink. Let's be blunt. Larry was a bond trader when he set out in his career. Larry has never studied a company balance sheet in all his life. He doesn't really give a two hoots what goes on within the companies, although he likes to give the impression that he does. And many people who don't understand what I've just explained, particularly politicians, don't get it either. So what can Larry do for the UK economy? Why was he invited into number 10? Because the idiots in there think that he in some way can dispense trillions of dollars into our economy to help us grow. The reality is that the best that Larry can actually do is advertise and get his sales representatives, hey, buy the FTSE index, or maybe buy the FTSE 350 index. It's very cheap at the moment. But he doesn't control the funds that are going into the UK economy. He doesn't have any direct control of that. And that's a complete misconception. Of course, Larry likes it because it makes people think that he's got this huge amount of power, because he can say, BlackRock has, got 1 trillion of assets in the UK, when in actuality, that's just 1 trillion of index funds that he doesn't really, care about. They do have what's called a private equity division. We touched on that last time. So they are doing, that's relatively tiny compared to what they do. So there is a certain amount he can do. But this idea that, these big index funds can, stimulate investment in the UK is just for for the birds.
Sorry to jump in because we're going to have to end. But Ian, in many ways, as you say about the passive fund, they don't really care what the company does. What we're talking about, for those of us that care, you care, there is this morality, e.g. people they don't want to engage with really what's happening on the ground. They do not want to invest, see how these companies are growing and how they can help. Ian, I'm really sorry to cut you off because it's coming up to an hour. And I thank you for your time. I thank you for your time, because this is so important, because there are things to explain where we're at, and we have to go back into history. So I just want to thank everyone for joining us. Ian and I will be talking again regularly. Because I am so enjoying picking his brain and having these history lessons, and because we haven't even gone to the whole Clinton administration, Larry Sisman, the Glass-Steagall Act, etc., etc.
There's so much to talk about.
There is so much to talk about, and I think it's really, really important.
Well, I enjoyed it as well. If I can interrupt, Mark, I enjoy it as well. I come from a family of educators. My father was a headmaster, mum was a school teacher, and I really enjoy trying to help people, friends and family who ask me. That's why I'm training to become an independent financial advisor at the moment, because I want to bring some of this knowledge to eventually clients or potential clients, and I love doing these things, Mark. So.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Let's go.
Thank you. We'll do it. Maybe one day we can get Liam Halligan on and have a three-way discussion, because that'd be brilliant.
Liam knows a lot more than I do. And
no, I do. You're getting there, but we'll do that. I'm going to play us out, but thank you so much, everybody, for joining us.
Thanks, Mark. Thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you.